right, welcome to the Gooder Podcast. I am your host, Diana Freich. As partner and CMO of Retail Voodoo, an award-winning branding agency, I have met and worked with some of the most amazing women in the naturals industry: food, beverage, wellness, fitness. As such, I decided to create the Gooder Podcast to interview these great people and subject matter experts and have them share their insights, expertise, and even passions to help businesses all around the world become gooder. I have a very interesting guest to bring to the program today. At least she's very interesting to me because of what she does. Karen Ha, who is the CEO of Joywell, which is a food tech company here, not in Seattle, but you're in Seattle.
That's correct.
Yeah, it's out of the Bay Area?
It's out of Davis, California.
Out of Davis. Okay, a food tech company that makes high quality natural protein sweeteners and taste modifiers using both plant fermentation and technology. She brings a deep background in consumer brand and products from 15 years in the food and beverage industry. Prior to Joywell Foods, Karen served as VP of Product Development and Brand Strategy at Bulletproof 360. It's a favorite of ours here in the office, a food and beverage brand. And Starbucks Coffee Company for nearly 11 years in a wide range of roles, including coffee innovation. Let's see, a little bit of RTD in there, and packaged coffee, as well as you were involved in the acquisition of Evolution Fresh. Before joining Starbucks, Karen was an investment professional who worked at 2 tech venture capital firms. Welcome, Karen. How are you today?
I am great. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. You're in Seattle, of course,
yes,
all the way across town.
With some rain, as one might expect, but given wildfires,
finally
couldn't celebrate rain more.
I know it. And you and your family getting settled into this new school year okay?
Depends how you define the word settled. That is really what it depends, but without completely getting us way off track. It's a day-by-day situation and we're figuring it out.
Yeah, same with our family. Yeah. Well, so I'm really excited to speak with you today because I'm fascinated about the impact of food tech and its impact on natural and better for you product space. And I can't wait to get to your thoughts about it. But before I do, I love the journey. I would love to hear a little bit more about how you got to Joywell. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit. I mean, we got your history, but like maybe personally, how did Joywell end up being on your radar?
Yeah. So I first came across Joywell Foods, which back in the day, really back before July of this year, was called Miraculex by a recruiter. And they reached out, I want to say May, June timeframe in 2019. And truth be told, I was not looking. I was pretty busy at Bulletproof. Almost any role. I can't think of a role that I haven't done this, but usually I'm so busy, the thought of looking for another job just seems impossible. And they reached out and were looking for a new leader with an interesting consumer story, with a very interesting technology. And it was very much a curiosity killed the cat kind of situation, but in the most positive way, where a lot of these calls that come in, I just want to hear about the opportunity and then call it good.
Sure.
And this one had a lot more teeth in that, as you can see, as I just crossed my 1-year mark at Joywell.
Nice. Oh, congratulations. Tell us the story of Joywell. Now, you just talked about the name change. Like you had a name change, kind of an overhaul there, pretty significant rebrand. Nice investment this summer. Give us the backstory. Where did it start and where's it going?
Yeah, so the name change started, it was one of the first things I wanted to do. And in fact, in my very first call with a recruiter, I asked if I could change the name of the company because Miraculex just sounds too much like Miralax, and I think most of us know that's a laxative, and I wasn't very excited about being called something that sounded like a laxative. And there are other challenges too, and we can get into it, but further into the podcast. But Miraculex sounds a lot like Miraculin, which is one of the proteins that we're pursuing, but it's
Mm-hmm.
only one of the proteins. And I think it creates some confusion around partnerships and potential investors as we
Gotcha.
have conversations, because they've become so hyper focused on just Miraculin, which we can get into later. But the backstory is our founder had a family member who was diagnosed with cancer some time ago, and as often the case may be, when you undergo chemotherapy, you lose your ability to taste things.
Mm-hmm.
And he had stumbled upon Miraculin as a way to address your inability to taste. And so that's where the seed began, where the idea started, and blossomed from there, no pun intended. And really the rebrand is all about acknowledging that we're not only about one protein, but also to create more emotion around the benefit we provide.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, we are addressing our addiction to sugar. Our
Mm-hmm.
mission is to reinvent the everyday experience of eating everyday foods, but with less sugar. And the experience of eating things with less sugar now um, isn't great in the consumer packaged foods
Yeah.
category. And there are, don't get me wrong, I mean, there are some good I don't want to say alternatives, there are some great products out there, but for the most part in the mainstream, it's pretty bleak. And so the name was very much centered around capturing that feeling of tasting something great that's super satisfying and bringing that joy to consumers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, this might be a question that you maybe can or can't answer, but so when I hear like we're moving away from the protein and we're talking about foods, is Joywell going to expand outside of ingredients, or are you wanting to stay in ingredients, or can you say, or do you know?
It's actually the most common question we get, actually.
Okay.
We do know. So COVID threw a monkey wrench in some things and how we conceive of going to market, but we are a bit of both,
Mm-hmm.
actually. And we're not the only company out there to conceive of this type of business model. But
Mm-hmm.
really, at the end of the day, if I were to step back and tell you what we're trying to achieve, we're trying to reduce sugar consumption. And if
Uh-huh.
that is our mission, really the fastest way to do that is to get our ingredients in the hands of as many manufacturers as
Yeah.
possible.
Great.
It goes without saying, for us to say that we could do it faster ourselves, frankly, is ridiculous. But having said that, it's also important for us to compel manufacturers to do that.
Uh-huh.
And part of that, creating that story, is showing them how it's done, because these proteins are novel and they're different. And I would say in the conversations we've had with various CPG companies, they certainly are very aware they exist. So it's not
Mm-hmm.
so novel that we're coming completely out of left field.
Mm-hmm.
However, they do need, while they're very excited, they always need a push, because the larger the company, the slower you go. And
Right.
I think that push comes in the form of demonstrating how it can be done. And I think from a brand perspective, since I'm a marketer by trade, there's something to be said of controlling that first experience with these
Mm-hmm.
proteins, and
Mm-hmm.
the fear or the concern around another company taking a crack at it and then potentially messing it up, and then
Yeah.
making the first consumer experience with these proteins stilted out of the gate.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a little bit of a murky answer to your question, but the simplest one is both ingredients and
Sure.
products.
Okay. I'd be curious. I'm curious. Well, maybe we'll answer this a little bit later, but the adoption by these big CPGs from an ingredient, I'm curious as, are you getting a lot of inquiries from these larger organizations? Are they curious, or do you find that most of the inquiries and demand is coming from the smaller innovative brands?
It's coming across the board,
Really?
to be honest. Yeah.
Wow.
So we've had a number of conversations with CPG companies that everybody knows, and then and also ones that people have no idea who they are, to be
Yeah.
honest. And
There's
so
plenty
it
of
really
those.
runs the whole gamut, and it would
Mhm.
make sense. And I think there, from my perspective, pros and cons for those different types of partnerships from a speed standpoint. But
Sure.
when you think about the better for you category and how much it has exploded, it makes sense that anyone who has a booth at an Expo West, whenever that actually comes back,
Yeah.
would be potentially interested in something like this
Uh-huh. Interesting.
because it would strengthen their better for you positioning.
Hmm. Well, let's when we kind of go back into that path of how you came to Joywell. My husband is a recovering biohacker, I like to call it. Still a huge Bulletproof fan every day, and Bulletproof was kind of this new, like the first biohacking brand, first brand to really come out and get any kind of traction and velocity that kind of started hitting the mainstream. Do you have any interesting stories of what it was like to work there when things were just like, going crazy?
Yeah, I mean, where can I begin? So, I joined Bulletproof in November 2015. It was a lot smaller. It had been a few months since they had finished raising their Series A, and it was a long list of a very interesting, a very long, interesting list of ideas from Dave. And interesting isn't meant to be a euphemism, but coming at a place like Starbucks where you can, I think the average person might conceive of what the innovation pipeline might look like, or
Mm-hmm.
get it at least 50% correct. I had no idea what I was getting myself into, and so really in the early days, and I had a lot to learn. And in fact,
Uh-huh.
those learnings inform me to this very day. But um, in the beginning, it was very much the traditional startup phase where everything was trial by fire. We had people with varying level of work experience.
Mm-hmm.
Bulletproof actually, and perhaps benefits from this, given COVID, has a bit of heritage being a remote work setup, with
Mm.
Dave living in Vancouver Island.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was my first time working at a company, primarily working at home, especially in the first 2 years, and trying to make stuff happen. And with a group of people who weren't necessarily classically trained in any way, which is
Yeah.
not problematic, but it's more about how do you calibrate to a totally different set of variables and make it go fast.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to think of a story for you on the fly. I can't think of one right
That's okay.
now.
Well, I just wonder, I mean, was he a little bit Willy Wonka-ish? I mean, sometimes there were times when you guys would just come out with so much at the same time that I felt like, as a consumer, now we see a lot of brands doing that, where there's a lot of like, let's push out and see what works, like a lot of testing and learning. But at the time it was just like, wow, okay, that this is going, we're doing these now. Like, was it Willy Wonka-ish, or was it a bit more measured? It just felt like there was just so much.
I actually think it was more of the latter. And granted, I'm biased because that was my responsibility,
Yeah.
to be
Mm-hmm.
clear.
So
But
you had to manage Willy Wonka, maybe.
right, yeah. I mean, and everything that Dave came up with, to be crystal clear, is that there was a reason for being in his head every idea that
Absolutely.
he came up with.
Yes.
Whether
Yes.
the question really is, well, how much appetite is there for this thing that I know you want, but
Right.
is it just you and your 10 friends, or is it you and 10 million friends? That's a different
Yes.
story. And so I think that's the equation that we had to step through.
Yes.
And um, it was a lot of products. I have never launched so many products in my life. And and I had an extraordinary team to help me with that,
Mm-hmm.
no doubt about it. But though it probably from an outsider's perspective, and if you weren't really familiar with Dave or his books,
Yeah.
it probably felt very scattershot. But those who are close followers would know that everything we launched was actually very closely aligned with the Bulletproof Diet book
Mm-hmm.
and the subsequent books after that, Headstrong, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And so really what we were trying to capitalize was this brand equity that
Yeah.
he created. And I think that, I mean, if I were to say anything that was an interesting experience during that time that I had never experienced elsewhere, is growing a business in tandem with someone's brand equity also skyrocketing at the same
Oh,
time.
uh-huh. Well, and I mean, what you're saying is very common with our experience working with founder owner brands. You know, they've got this vision, and sometimes they're really good at articulating, and other times not so much. But or this just kind of like helping them commercialize what they're thinking, this lifestyle that they're thinking, can be so much fun. It's a roller coaster because there's emotion behind it. You know, founder owners are passionate about what they're doing. And so it takes somebody like you who can go, okay, let's do it this way. And which that's probably where, you know, I'm looking at, you know, I'm thinking of your experience from Bulletproof and how it might be influencing what you're doing today. And then there's the Starbucks component of it. So maybe we talk a little bit about, okay, well, so what is it from Bulletproof that you bring to Joywell? And then what is it from Starbucks? Like, there's got to be some of both, clearly.
Yes, definitely. So if I would start with Starbucks, I think what I learned, and I learned it without actually knowing that I was learning it, to be honest, because that's where I got my first marketing chops, is how important it is to have a consistent brand experience and to
Mm-hmm.
mean what you say and actually do it. And
Mm-hmm.
there were just things um, that we all knew that we had to abide by to respect the brand, not to cheapen the brand. And even though it is a mainstream brand, there are just certain things you wouldn't do from a brand perspective
Right.
to um, dilute what it stands for.
Mm-hmm.
And that consistency, learning about that consistency and that messaging and what you mean and what you're providing to the consumer and understanding what you're promising to the consumer, is something that I carried through
Mm-hmm.
to Bulletproof, and something that we worked really hard to create consistency around the messaging, the branding, uh, how we talk about Dave, how we talk about the
Yeah.
brand, and what are there are so many things important to Dave about what he's done and what he's discovered, because basically Bulletproof is the manifestation of everything that he's learned
Mm-hmm.
uh, in his own time. But how do we tell that story in a way that makes sense to the average person, and
Yeah.
really hone in on that communication so that story really can sing? That's what I carry through um, from Starbucks. And then with from Bulletproof to Joywell, what I really carried forward is there are two main things that come to mind. One is pretty broad, and then one is much more specific. One is, and this applies to Starbucks too, actually, as I think about it, is that uh, how much it matters to me specifically to work for a mission driven or purpose driven brand, and how much that drives my personal motivation to show up every day and do what I do. And I mean, that was part of the appeal when I first got the call from a recruiter, is that Joywell is standing for something that is a really
Mm-hmm.
massive challenge, a multifaceted challenge, which I would say that Joywell is only one part of a multi-layered solution to it,
Yeah. Yeah.
that is sugar consumption. And I realized that's really important for my own motivation and my own job satisfaction. The other thing that I learned that's very specific to carrying forward from Bulletproof is the role of alternative sweeteners and sugar alcohols,
Yeah.
and how hard it is to formulate with them. I'm really proud of the product portfolio that I was involved with at Bulletproof, and I'm sure they'll continue to innovate it and bring it to the next level. But figuring out how to make things taste great without sugar is really hard, not to mention preserving them and making sure they have some reasonable shelf life to survive on a shelf, grocery store shelf for some time without sugar is its own challenge. And so understanding that landscape, what food scientists face, what brand managers face when trying to create a really compelling offering is something that I have lived myself and take with me at Joywell. And as I have these conversations with CPG companies and as we develop concepts of our own, it's something that I very much have in mind, because what we're not trying to be is another lousy tasting ingredient.
Yeah. Interesting. I can literally see the experiences from just those two brands being so powerful for you in this role right now. And like of the two brands that you could be coming from, like how great, I mean, whoever, like that Joywell has you, I hope they know that is a gift. I want to talk a little bit about this, kind of a two-part question, and it's a little bit not tricky but sticky, right? So food tech has been around for a long time. Like, we don't have Cheetos without food tech. Like, let's be honest. In the naturals industry, food tech has kind of only in the last few years really, really exploded in the way that the consumer demand has now started adopting naturals and better for you lifestyles and that type of thing. There's a lot of opportunity in the research that I've done prior up to here. I see like the growth potential is pretty enormous. What do you think is driving the demand?
Is it food tech specifically?
Well,
Or
products that are being generated from food technology, like food technology in the natural space. Is it like, are we looking at diets? Is this a sustainability thing, or does the consumer even really know?
My opinion is strictly that. I mean, it's a hypothesis, but
Sure.
I think one is for consumers that are very savvy, which I would say most natural channel consumers are.
Yeah.
There is an awareness piece of basically methane in cows, and we can't feed the world's population with the cow population that we have, and it's as basic as that. And I do think that there's awareness around that, and that drives people's interest in participating in those categories.
Mm-hmm.
I would also say that by the virtue of the fact that Whole Foods would carry Beyond Meat, Impossible Foods, so on and so forth, they effectively endorse those brands as natural channel, acceptable for the natural channel.
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
I think that implicit endorsement also makes a really big difference in making people feel more comfortable around something that, when you peel back the layers of the onion, especially as it relates to them, both of them have many different ingredients to arrive at their final, finished good. But it's in the case of Impossible, where their process is not dissimilar to Joywell. There's a fermentation component to what they're doing, and I think that generally by having it in store, Whole Foods helps dispel any concern around that. I'm not saying there isn't concern, but I don't see it rising to the surface very often, and nor that I believe that it should. But frankly, I'm surprised and glad that it doesn't seem to be as big a deal as it is. I would also say it doesn't hurt to have solid ad campaigns, which both brands have done really well in that regard, and that just drives awareness through the roof.
Well, exactly. And when you have, when we're talking about endorsement, not only do you have Whole Foods, which is really catering to kind of like the elite upper middle class, but
Right.
then you've got Burger King.
Right.
Like the Burger King component to me is what's so fascinating to me, because that is Gen Pop right there. That's a whole group of people who aren't going into Whole Foods. These are your Kroger buyers. These are your Walmart buyers. And now they have access to something completely different and so I feel like I don't know where Burger King has gone, if they're still carrying the product or not, but just the fact that it was announced and then supported by ad campaigns was like, I was just, wow, this is great. And then you were seeing that with KFC and all sorts of
Yeah.
alternative proteins. I love that, because I think that there's a huge, like the naturals industry, we are so smart and we know how to live really healthy lives, but our products are so expensive and often out of reach for a number of people in the United States.
Totally
And so
agree.
love that food technology is going to maybe allow us to bridge that gap and start to not only bring those products there, but then to educate people so that it's not naturals reaching in this way, but that we're kind of building the bridge from two different sides. Does that make sense?
That makes complete sense to me. And I would say, I think that is one of the core challenges in my mind in the better for you category in general, is that um, in a pitch we were talking about brands in the better for you category, and someone said, but challenge is we're making healthy people healthier with those offerings.
Right.
And I think
Yep.
that person is right. I think absolutely correct. And not that that's anyone's intent, because there's certainly a lot of money to be made to be more mainstream, but there's, I think, two components, which one of which is, price, as you mentioned, but also just being resonant to the consumer, which a lot of these brands aren't. And
No.
once you hit Burger King, I thought it was genius, because you basically put yourself in the minds of a different population of people who relate to Burger King and maybe go to
Yeah.
Burger King on a regular basis. And
Absolutely.
it makes it more accessible. And when it comes time for them to pick it up at their Walmart, then it won't
Right.
feel very foreign.
Absolutely. And you get away from that stigma of a veggie burger. Like you've got this group of people over here aren't touching veggie burgers because they heard in 1948 that they tasted gross. You know what I mean? And like that you have the accessibility to even try it. Low cost, like a burger at Burger King versus, a pound of meat or whatever. So I think it's really great. And that's actually, I think we talked about this when part of my goal with this podcast is just get us to start looking outside the audience. Had a really great conversation with somebody today who said there is a huge segment of the population, people who are not upper middle class, but middle class and even lower middle class, that are still willing to buy the products, but they're not on the radar because they're not considered a target audience. And they're not getting the education, they're not being brought along, and so therefore they're not getting the benefits. So I love that, the work that companies like yours are doing is like going to start to move there. And I think that's like my next question is around this confusion component. It's almost like we're talking about it a little bit. There is some confusion about, we talk about Beyond Meat and Impossible Burger. This is already a couple of years old, at least for people who like us who are in the prime target audience, where we're already beyond the fact that, okay, well, we know what Impossible is. We know what Beyond is. Now we're talking to this other audience and bringing them along. And do you feel like everybody's over the fact that Beyond Meat and Impossible are scary, and that you can get protein from sugar and you can eat lower? We've had some products come in the market that weren't great, like reduced fat, which was a big,
Yeah.
how is Joywell kind of defining the role, or what is your position about it? I understand what your end goal is, but how do you help the CPGs and retailers understand how to talk to their consumers about your products and what food tech's role is?
Yeah. So there's a lot in there. I think
Yeah.
what I would say most broadly is that and a lot of the conversations that I have, I think there's some confusion about, because food tech is so, it's impossible in particular is so synonymous to food
Yeah.
tech that there's
Yeah.
almost nothing else. Like the alternative meat situation is huge,
Yeah.
and it, as it should be, because it's a huge opportunity, but it has a corollary with all things that are plant-based. And I think what
Uh-huh.
gets convoluted is this universe of alternative meat and plant-based food that's acceptable for vegans, and whether, and that being good for the environment
Uh-huh.
and good for you. And I would
Uh-huh.
argue that they're not always both.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not necessarily specific to Impossible Foods, but that I think if there is a theme to the last 12 to 18 months, because there always is one, if there was an Expo West this past March, the theme would have been plant-based. But
Uh-huh.
I think what people fail to realize, if you really look at a nutrition facts panel, plant-based doesn't mean better for you. It just means that it's plant-based and doesn't
Right.
have
Right.
the
Mm-hmm.
animal products, and it can have a lot of sugar. And so I find that those dynamics to be interesting, because it's a lot like when someone says they're vegetarian but their diet is primarily comprised of French fries or something like that. I mean, that's not actually really healthy, but it
Totally. Yeah.
makes the conversation less clear. And then,
Yes.
and for sure. And then with Joywell, I mean, really, I think what I'm very happy about is that our mission is so clear
Yeah.
that it doesn't fall under the same, it doesn't have the same convoluted situation that
Gotcha.
alternative meats that are plant-based, because we are plant-based, because
Yeah.
we're derived from a fruit, our proteins
Right.
are derived from fruits, but we're not really talking about being a plant-based brand. What we're talking about is addressing sugar consumption,
Mm-hmm.
providing great tasting, truly great tasting alternatives,
Mm-hmm.
and making them legitimate options for people to um, to consume as part of their everyday routine. And we just focus on that story and
Yeah.
that story alone, and it just becomes a conversation about. And
Yeah.
that story resonates. There's not a single person I ever talked to that story does not resonate with. I think
Yeah.
the question then becomes, when can you do it? How fast can you do it? What
Yes.
products can I do it with?
Yes.
And those are all ongoing conversations.
Mm-hmm. I'm reminded by when Whole Foods had removed like the organic category in their store, because they're like, well, that's a feature and benefit. Or a feature instead of like, no, I feel like that's what's going on with plant-based right now. Just because it's plant-based it's not its own designation anymore. You can have plant-based ice cream that can have 37 grams of sugar per serving in there, and that's not any better or worse than a traditional ice. I mean, it could be from a cow perspective. There's a bunch of different ways we can slice and dice that, right? But first, from a health standpoint, you kind of go, okay, well, what's important here? So having Joywell focus on the brand and the lifestyle and what the goal of the brand is really great, and kind of moving away from just simply like, we are another plant-based protein or sugar that's protein that comes from sugar that comes from protein, sugar that comes from protein.
It's a protein that comes from fruit, actually.
From
But yeah, I mean, I
fruit.
know what you're trying. Yeah.
Let's just talk a little bit about consumer adoption. We talked about it a little bit already. Back when we started working with naturals brands in 2011, naturals was completely different. It's in the last few years, things have changed quite a bit, from being kind of like this hippie alternative lifestyle to a little bit more super sexy. I think the last time I was at Expo or Fancy Foods or one of them, I'm like, you've got celebrity chefs on the floor, you've got athletes on the floor starting brands. And so I'm wondering, and you may have already answered this, but like, who's really adopting this? Is this like, are we talking about the upper, or like where are you seeing it? Are you seeing a demographic, a psychographic by and large, or is it a little bit more broad based?
I mean, I'll give you the most generalized answer. I do think there are exceptions, obviously, to every rule,
Yeah.
but I think it's a clearly middle to upper class person, both male and female, who shop at Whole Foods and Trader Joe's and Costco. They're shopping at multiple stores for different reasons. Now, keep in mind, my opinion is doesn't consider
Oh
COVID.
no,
So who knows? Like COVID throws everything out the window. But pre-COVID behaviors, that's what it would be.
Yeah.
They are keenly interested in their own wellness and are either actively trying to lose weight or just actively trying to feel better. And I think what you're asking is, who's ultimately adopting these products that you see athletes and celebrity chefs hawking. And I think it goes back to what I said is people who are already healthy. Because I think people who are already healthy are looking for things that are still healthy.
Different version of healthy. Yeah.
Yeah, they just want something different because most people, to overgeneralize, admittedly, want some variety and they want to discover things and it's fun. And expo, I mean, you could literally spend, I don't think the expo floor is open that long, but if it was open for 12 to 16 hours, you could probably only work one section of the section
one
A
building
of the floor,
and
still haven't gone to B, C, D, E in the other building. And there's quite a lot to be discovered, but I don't think the same motivation exists for the generalized mainstream. I think part of it is lifestyles are different, what they can afford is different. And this might be stating the obvious, but when you think about the role of paid media and pulling these consumers in, to build a business, you're very motivated to target the people who you think will most likely buy. And so then you target people like me. And that becomes a vicious circle because you never actually target the people who fall outside this certain demographic.
Yeah. I met this really powerful woman today, and don't let me forget later to send you her contact information. She told me that middle class and lower middle class families love to experiment, but the reason why they don't is because it's the cost, but it's not the cost of buying the product. It's the cost of buying the product and then not liking it. And so they don't experiment as much because they're afraid if they don't like it, they've now wasted that dollar amount. And so for that group, she's an advocate for people for this demographic. She said those people have less opportunity because marketers think that there's not an audience there. But the reality is the audience needs to be captured differently. Then, like for me, if I go to the store and I'm at Markets, that's my place where I shop. If I go down there and I happen to see a couple of products that I want to try, I'll throw it in there. And if it's a bust, then it's a bust. It's no big deal for me. Versus somebody else who's measuring every purchase. They're not going to try something new when they know that their kid is going to eat this or their spouse is going to eat this or whatever. So I think there's a different opportunity to get in front of those consumers. They just have to be approached a different way.
Yeah, and the irony of that is that's the demographic that probably needs it the most, these better alternatives.
It is. It is. Oh my gosh. 7% more children that are of color have more food allergies and intolerances than Caucasian. This was what I learned today. And they have something like a 3x percentage of death from food related illnesses because their parents either don't know that it's a food allergy that their kid's dealing with, or they just don't have the resources to get what they need from them. So there's a lot to unpack there in another day, but it's just very interesting. Yeah.
That is very interesting.
So let's talk a little bit about something exciting that happened. You announced a round of investment this year, actually in July, so just a couple months ago.
Yeah.
Which means you were pitching during COVID. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, we really started pitching in earnest in January, and we're really busy relying on in-person meetings, spending a lot of time in the Bay Area. our seed investor, Coastal Ventures, is really helpful in making introductions. And with growing interest, although at the time I would have told you that the interest wasn't high enough, but growing interest in food tech. I mean, we had plenty of meetings for sure. I mean, I don't know that I could have taken more meetings. At the time, but COVID hit and it really changed the complexion. And candidly, I wasn't sure how it was going to change our situation. We're really lucky in that we have very committed seed investors, but when you don't know how long, and we still don't know how long the COVID situation is going to last, if you don't raise money, you're kind of wondering, I was left wondering, are we going to tread water? What are we going to achieve? Are we really achieving anything if we're treading water? All these questions go through your head, and you're worried about your staff and a whole litany of things. And what ended up happening was there was a bit of a pause in pitching, and then we went right back to pitching all over again, and it was just done virtually, which was great because the volume was still high. But I think then the challenge there was creating that human connection and reading the tea leaves in these conversations to see how these conversations are going, because sometimes you don't get a lot of feedback. I would actually say that most of the time you don't get that much feedback. And so you're navigating so much without the benefit of body language. Personally, I didn't have any problem pitching over Zoom or Google Hangouts. You choose a platform. I probably have used it at this point. But just like any communication stream, it takes two to tango. And if the other person on the other side, the other firm on the other side, aren't great at adapting to this new normal of constantly communicating via video, then it gets really hard. That's the other thing, is that you just can't connect with them because it's just radically so different. And I spoke with one venture capitalist along the way, just asking what his experience was like. And one of them said, we're out still investing, but it's just really hard to find the deals you want to invest in when you don't have that connection, that connectivity that's actually in person. And so, but suffice to say, we reconnected with Evolve, I want to say in late February. So before everything really went south. And they're based in Chicago, and we connected with Steve Sanger and his team, and we had planned to meet in mid-March, but that actually ended up being the week where really the world shut down. Conferences got canceled, schools closed, and so no one was going anywhere. And we just continued to have the conversation, and Steve and his team are, they just do business as if nothing's changed. And, now it's just online versus being in person. And this is away we go. And I think with that mindset coming from his team, it was just full steam ahead and building that relationship, understanding us as a team and understanding their interest in us as a company, and just fielding all the questions that came along the way. So it was certainly a wild ride. I think the fundraising activity was one thing because all online and trying to build a relationship. I think that the wild card really for me was my children, and trying to do so many external pitches, and praying to God that they don't barge in the middle of one or have like a temper tantrum while I'm having a pitch. And miraculously that never happened. And I don't know,
my goodness,
but they have totally barged into meetings, but they just, maybe they feel a vibe and they just don't barge into pitches. And somehow I need to achieve that vibe more often, because that vibe doesn't exist anymore. But that was really the hardest part, is just being a parent, managing whatever learning that was existing at that time, and fundraising at the same time.
That's it's so fun. There's so much in there, right? Like my kids were very respectful in the very beginning, and now when I'm working from home, they just come in and will start talking to me, and I will try to ignore them, and they will just insist. I'm like, what are you guys doing? What's happening here?
My kids' new thing is, and I guess I should be glad because it's forcing them to write more, is to hand me notes.
Oh yes.
With text boxes that say,
Yeah.
check yes or no if I can use
Yes.
iPad or something like that. But what
Yes.
they don't realize is that I can't really read something while I'm talking and pitching it,
Exactly.
or they haven't barged into a pitch for just talking in general, and so that's added. It creates some friction with them, but it just is what it is.
That's what it is. So when you're, I'm like thinking to myself, we're talking about investment. And we talked about kind of the celebrity status of the naturals industry, better for you industry, and then the food techs. That money, that it feels like there was just a decided shift. I want to say in January 2019, when I went to Fancy Foods, it was a probably because it was in San Francisco, but I just felt like there were more people there that were former tech, like literally technology companies that were there at Fancy Food Show. And then within a year, all the sexy came in, like Expo West went full on sexy. And I wonder, I don't know if that was just my impression, or do you feel that same way too? Do you feel like food and food technology has it passed traditional technology, like electronics and or are they on par? From an investment standpoint, I would say.
That's a tough question for me to answer because I'm not tracking
Yeah.
at a macro level, but
Yeah.
but I would say that there seems to be tremendous amount of interest in food tech in general. There was just an article that came out yesterday, and I'm happy to send it to you.
Yeah.
By TechCrunch, saying that in the first 7 months of the year, food tech raised some total of $1.5 billion.
Wow.
And I think that's a very compelling data point. I can't tell you what that number was in the first 7 months of 2019, but suffice to say, it's a headline. I'm guessing that it's a lot bigger than it was last year. And so I do think there's a lot of interest in the space. I think there's growing interest. I have observed that there seem to be more firms poking in this area in the last 6 months, so post-COVID, than there were when I was building my list back in November, December of who to go out to pitch. There's so many more firms out there, and having conversations more recently, I'm thinking, where were you back then? But
exactly.
But it's really exciting to see a lot more interest, and there are companies like Impossible Foods, Perfect Day have shined a light. Is that the right word? But they've created a lot of created awareness around this space that Joywell is certainly benefiting from.
That's great.
And there's so much that can be done with this technology across the food chain, whether it's alternative meat, alternative seafood, so on and so forth.
Sure. Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit. We're going to shift a little bit from the industry a little bit. Let's talk about kind of your leadership, right? Maybe a little bit more your leadership style. Maybe we can talk about some of the most influential experiences you've had in your career and how they help you be a leader in this kind of space where anything is possible.
Yeah. So let's see. If I had to pick the most influential experiences, if I would go back to the beginning, where one of my first jobs was working in tech VC. I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't understand probably 80% of what I was reading because the technology companies of all kinds, secure software, hardware. I mean, I can't even properly repeat the things I was looking at back in 1997, a long time ago. But what I did learn was reading through a lot of business plans and what makes a great business and what makes a lousy business, and certainly in the eyes of a potential investor. So I learned a lot just by sheer repetition. I was an investment professional at 2 different VC firms, so I've read and skimmed thousands of executive summaries and pitches at this point, and with repetition, you learn a lot. So that's, I think, Number one. Number two, and it's actually not in my bio because it's brief on a relative scale, is that between my two VC jobs, I was at a startup in New York called Cosmo.com.
Uh-huh.
And it was, I chuckle now because Amazon's just started doing this in the last couple of years, but we were trying to deliver videos back when people actually watched videos and DVDs, in under an hour to people's homes. And it started in New York
Yes.
City, eventually expanded to Seattle and a few other cities. And I was based in New York. I was employee 19. There are people who sleep at the office because they didn't have an apartment.
I remember that. I remember those days.
and none of us, Frank, I didn't think, and I'm probably insulting someone probably, but I don't think any of us knew what we were doing. But that's actually what made it so great, honestly, is that I had no idea what I was doing. I had no frame of reference. I was assigned to inventory management at one point, figuring out how to launch alcohol at another point. I don't know up or down where I'm supposed to begin, where I'm supposed to end. I just know the questions I would ask. And that was a really fun ride because it really gave me an eye into what it means to be at a startup.
Yeah.
And that experience has lived with me, honestly, to this very day, because without that experience, I don't know that I actually would have ever gone to Bulletproof, to be honest. And I now when I understand startup crazy, I actually know what that means because I've done it a few times now, and I know what I'm signing up for, and I also know what other people are experiencing too.
Yeah,
so,
you have some empathy.
And just to be nimble and know how to operate, because I'm not 20 something anymore, and I don't want to sleep at the office.
What?
If it wasn't COVID, and so I brought a lot of learnings of how I would do it again, and how I would want the 20 somethings at Joywell to proceed, which is not necessarily the way I did it.
Yes.
So Starbucks, and with Starbucks, I alluded to it before, but it is this whole idea of general management, and that you can't get by just being a marketer, or the person that does finance, or the person that gets to taste stuff in the R&D lab. You got to do it all, and you have to be comfortable at some level with doing it all, even if you don't like it all. And that has been really helpful to me because it has basically foundation for me to be a cross-functional leader.
Yeah.
And I don't know that I could be where I am today without that foundation, because fundamentally that's how I operate. That's just my operating system.
And do you feel like, so you're a cross-functional leader, are you able to help your team, because it's always, when you're managing down and you're leading a team, particularly those that don't have the experience as you, and you want to not just build your team to be really awesome at their one job as you're identifying, do you have a way, or do you have a system, or that you like to encourage your team to grow? Like, do you have them do cross-functional roles? Is that part of your vetting process, or?
So ultimately it depends on the job itself.
Sure.
But generally speaking, I encourage everyone to partake in cross-functional projects, because being siloed as a subject matter expert is a really difficult place to be, especially as you rise in the ranks and then you look left and look right and don't understand what anyone's saying, or don't understand why people aren't getting along or not understanding you. That's a really frustrating experience, but it comes from, it could happen anyway, frankly, but it would be less surprising, and it could be mitigated by not operating in a silo, because it does happen all the time. But I think about individuals on my team, I think about the goals they have today, and the goals and skills they have today, and the skills they need down the road to get to the next level. Because I think traditionally a lot of people get promoted based on their performance in role. They crushed it. They did everything they were supposed to do.
Yes.
They didn't get promoted, but getting promoted doesn't mean that if they've suddenly become a manager of 5 people from being an individual contributor,
Yeah.
it doesn't actually inform whether they're actually going to be a good manager. It just,
Right. Exactly.
it's a the promotion is a retroactive, is honoring what happened retroactively.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I try to think about is what are the skills they want,
Mm-hmm.
or ideally we would want them, but
Yes.
they would need at the next level, and let's get them there, and let's give them the projects that gets them there, and let's make sure they know that what they
Mm-hmm.
need to get there. And so there's the other side of this is my philosophy, which is really grounded in servant leadership and around the fact that I need to get out of the way sometimes, or
Yes.
most of the time, I should say. And my role is to provide guidance, to provide education, remove obstacles, but not to be too close to the situation every single time,
Yeah.
in every instance, and let
Sure.
just people run with it. And I think it's uncomfortable for people, but that's probably where people are most likely to learn. But the key component to all this and my philosophy comes down to the person and
Yeah.
who you hire or who I hire. If they are not interested in learning and growing and understanding what it means to move the needle on their own leadership acumen, then all that falls apart. And effectively, I would say bluntly that that's a bad hire,
Yeah.
in my mind, because you really can't advance them, and they're not motivated by a growth mindset.
Right.
And I'm very much a believer that you want an organization that's centered around a growth mindset, because at the end of the day, though we may be satisfied by their compensation or title,
Yeah.
that's always ephemeral. It's really the people and what you're learning, what you're getting out of it, that really creates retention and satisfaction
Yeah.
ultimately in people's
Yeah.
roles.
I'm like, I want my t-shirt that says choir here, because when I first started in the workforce, which was in the 90s, I spent a good chunk of time working at Safeco Insurance. I don't know if you're from the Northwest, but so Safeco Insurance was very much insurance driven, and it was very much like, okay, well, now that you've done, we call it individual contributor, now that you've had these 3 roles in your job, and now the next level in order for you to get a raise is to make you a manager. And I saw so many people and teams just absolutely crash into that format. It's just because you're ready for more challenge and opportunity doesn't necessarily make you a good manager, and vice versa. And so I love hearing that you are in an organization. Well, you get to run, this is your ship, so this is how you're running it. Listen, I see that you're really great here, I'm going to grow you this way. I see that you're really great leading teams, I'm going to put you this way. And I just love that. And it's a very individualized role, individualized way of mentoring people to grow the organization.
Yeah, and I should add, our team is primarily comprised of scientists, and I have an extraordinary CTO, Jason Ryder, who is steering that ship of that team.
Yeah.
And part of what makes us a good fit, I mean, we are nothing alike in terms of skill set, which is actually ideal. But what also makes us a good fit is that we organically carry the same mindset around how to grow people and how to invest in people and keep them inspired.
Yeah.
I will say what also really helps is working for a mission-driven brand or company.
Totally.
Because many people are motivated by what we're doing and what we're trying to achieve, and that creates a level standard of how we're thinking about our day-to-day.
Yeah. Well, you naturally attract those types of people too. So it's not like you're trying to convince anybody of anything. It's a statement. So when we're talking about mission-driven brands, well, this is kind of a weird, not exactly a direct segue, but when you are looking at the marketplace in general, who who else are you watching? Who do you got your eye on? Or more, maybe the question is what are the CPG trends in 2020 that have you the most interested?
Yeah, so there are a few. I am intrigued by the innovation in beverages. And
Uh-huh.
there under that there's a couple different categories. There's the alcoholic kombucha.
Yes.
Brands like June Shine, I think, are very interesting because they carry somewhat of a health halo, but they're an alcoholic beverage,
Uh-huh.
obviously. But
Mhm.
then there's the sparkling category I just find fascinating because um, and there's just basically this category of healthy indulgence that's very
Yeah.
much emerging from Poppy to Oli Pop to Booch Pop, which is a new
Uh,
launch by Health Aid. There's a sparkling concept, botanical sparkling water from by Rishi Teas.
yes.
There's the United States of Sodas, I think.
Hmm.
And there's this whole range of sparkling where, a few years ago it was LaCroix and nothing else but LaCroix. But now there's
Yeah.
LaCroix and Waterloo. But now, and then there was Spindrift. But now it feels like the continuum is pushing closer to soda,
Yes.
carbonated soft drinks as we know them as kids, but not all the way there.
Yeah.
Some healthy alternative that's satisfying because it's still sweet.
Yeah.
And I mean, Olipop is actually one of my favorites because I mean, I don't know who's formulating their beverages, but
Yeah.
they are stellar,
Pretty
truly. And
great.
their cola, their root beer. I mean,
Yes.
they really harken back to another day
That's
in my
awesome.
life. That's not now, but maybe the teenage years.
Yeah.
And I think also the non-alcoholic, basically the sobriety category of drinks, whether it's Seedlip, um, and dry soda, which has been around for a while.
Yeah. It's
That
a former
category, I think, is
client
a
of ours.
yeah, and Curious Elixirs is another
Yes.
one. There seems to be a movement with younger millennials and Gen Z that are very interested in. I think there's a better term for it, and I just don't know it because I'm not deeply in this space
Yeah.
around these beverages that are centered around not being alcoholic
Yeah.
but still being satisfying.
It's a
Um,
it's a sober and sober curious movement. Actually, I just
yes.
interviewed Sherelle from Dry about this, and she's pushing quite heavily into that space. In fact, they just relaunched the website. If you get a moment, you could take a look at them. But
I'll check it
they are
out.
really pushing into kind of moving away from like, why is alcohol kind of like sugar? Why does alcohol have to be the way? Because there's a whole group of people that can't drink alcohol. And
Right.
then there's a whole group of people that don't want to drink alcohol. And then you go to a party, an adult party, and it's almost your only option. And so she's doing some pretty great things, and she's calling it the sober and sober curious movement.
That's great.
Yes, yes, and
It's better than what I said, which sounds
and
stupid.
she's coming out with a really great mocktail book too here in the next couple of weeks as well. So those are very interesting beverages. That must be something that you consume a lot of. You must try a lot of different product there.
I do try a lot of different products. Partially it comes from working in
Yeah.
CPG. I mean,
Yeah.
I do try a lot of beverages. I personally like beverages, and my first foray into this world was beverages. There were
Yeah.
RTD beverages for Japan, and so I just have a lot of history there, and
Yeah.
it's just a habit that's a tough habit to break.
I'm there with you. Well, our time is almost up, but I have a couple of questions that are kind of outside of, well, this one kind of crosses the bridge. One is I always ask my guests to share some sort of interesting tidbit that they could take to like a happy hour and kind of go, did you know? Like, do you have anything interesting that people might not know about? It could be about Joywell. It could be about sugar, proteins. It could be about fruit. It could anything like kind of related to your industry.
Yeah, I would just God, there's so many options. I would say it'd be about fermentation because ultimately we're producing these proteins via fermentation that
Mhm.
that sounds, when I say it in the context of a business podcast, that sounds scary and strange to many consumers. But reality is fermentation's been around for a really long time. It goes far back as 7,000 BC
Wow.
to create alcoholic beverages. And I think the first known example of alcoholic beverages in China, 7,000 BC-ish. I can't be quite precise, but way back when. And it's actually truly one of the first food technologies in the sense that it's one of the ways that people have been able to preserve food and also create food. When you think about things like sauerkrauts and kimchis, which are stored, but then also, and there's obviously alcoholic beverages, but then there are also things like beer, cheese, and lots of other things that I probably can't think of right now that that fermentation enables. So it's really the original food tech methodology, if you will.
All right, fermentation, the original food tech.
Yeah.
I love it. And then when you, I always like to know how is particularly because of COVID, and it's just something I find curious, is how are you unwinding from your day? How are you giving yourself kind of like, keeping yourself sane and centered, like going from the office to home? Like what are you doing for yourself?
That's a great question. Not enough, probably. But what I have done for myself is that, in the early days of COVID, probably starting sometime in February into early April, I was very obsessive compulsive in understanding what was happening with COVID. But as soon as it became very clear, and I probably waited too long, that COVID has become a political conversation, and we don't have to dive into that, but it just is.
Yeah, it is.
I actually just disassociated myself from media, and I really, I mean, not completely, but
sure.
But I really didn't get back on NewYorkTimes.com until the George Floyd incident. In fact, probably a little after, because I actually didn't know it had happened for some time, to be honest, because that's how much I dissociated myself.
Oh my goodness,
and
that was healthy.
I found that to be really helpful. That was one thing in light of COVID. The other thing is just taking time for myself and creating finding things to listen to, specifically podcasts and music that don't relate anything to COVID, news, my kids, work. And so I am a Rewatchables podcast addict.
Okay.
I find it really funny. And I listen to other podcasts too, in addition to that, but I enjoy listening to audiobooks and different podcasts that aren't news related or current events related, to mix things up and have a laugh. And sometimes it involves me laughing by myself as I'm walking down the street and looking like a complete crazy person very early in the morning. But you know what? That's what it takes.
That's okay. Oh, before we go, if somebody wanted to get a hold of you, LinkedIn's the best way, or do you have a different channel that you like?
LinkedIn is great.
Okay, great. Okay.
It really is.
And it's Karen, Karenhuh, correct?
That's correct.
That's the one and only. Excellent. Well, thank you so very much for joining me today and for sharing. I liked our little journey. It was kind of a little bit everywhere. A little bit of everything from your past, and I just am excited to see what Joywell is up to in the next few years. Very exciting times.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It was really fun.
This episode is sponsored by Retail Voodoo, a creative marketing firm specializing in growing, fixing, and reinventing brands in the food, beverage, wellness, and fitness industries. If your naturals brand is in need of positioning, package design, or marketing activation, we're here to help. You can find more information at retail-voodoo.com. And so there you go. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you so much for hanging out with us today. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to this channel and share with your network. Until next time, be well and do gooder.